Namaskar and a very good morning to all. It is with immense pleasure that I welcome you all to the 17th Sustainability Summit. And I'm very happy to share that in order to reduce the footprint, certain initiatives like reduced use of paper, no usage of plastic bottles, based bag wraps, drinks and sandwiches have been used at the summit. I would also like to inform you that participants can access the summit details by scanning the QR code, which is available in the holdings, standees, and registration table. It is indeed an honor and privilege to welcome all of you to the session on global risks and interconnections. I welcome all our distinguished dignitaries for the session. And some of our speakers are also joining virtually, so we'll be having them virtually with us. Now, I'd like to request our moderator, Mr. Prabodh Acharya, the Chief Sustainability Officer of the JSW Group, to share this session.
Thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful combinations that we have people online and people present here. So I hope one of our participants, Joe, is online. I hope, Joe, you can hear us and you are there. Let me start. One thing I want to start with is that I really like the idea of this conference where we are going to talk about the interconnection of risk, but most importantly, the theme of the conference is that how we look opportunity out of risk. We all are living in a very interconnected and interrelated world. And whatever we do locally or whatever happens globally has impact on each other. I'm sure you all are familiar with the World Economic Forum coming out with their risk report every year. And if you look at the last risk report, out of the top 5, the top 3 are environmental related risk. And the climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, social cohesion, erosion, and livelihood crisis. Out of that, the top 3 are environmental related risk. But there are interconnections between all of them, and we cannot see anything in isolations. As I stated, from a business perspective, we all love to see what are the opportunity. Of course, we have to be mindful of the risk. What we are really interested in that, what are the opportunities there? If you look at climate change is clearly a risk and everybody is talking about. But the way the energy transition is happening, the way the renewable energy is gaining momentum, the way the hydrogen is getting momentum, those are the opportunity which I'm sure all business world will be interested in. To discuss more about mainly the interconnection part and how we can take the opportunity. I have a panel which is illustrious in their own rights. I'll introduce them. To my left, Mr. Nitin Desai. He is former Under Secretary General, United Nations. I don't think he needs any introductions. You just open Wikipedia, you'll get to know all about him. We have online Joe Phelan. Joe, I hope you can hear us.
I hear you very well.
We are unable to hear you, but I'll come back to you. Joe is the Executive Director, Asia Pacific, and member of the Extended Leadership Group for World Business Council on Sustainability Development. He has really driving the agenda of creating sustainable business world, sustainable business practices across Asia. And he has worked tremendously in the all Indian businesses. So thank you to have Joe with us today remotely. And I hope, I'm sorry that the session get delayed and thanks for your patience. To my right, I have Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. She is Chair Environmental Economics and Head Environmental and Resource Economics Unit, Institute of Economic Growth. So without being between you and my speakers, illustrious speaker, what I'll request each of the speakers, first I'll come to Mr. Desai, to talk your opening remarks about the global risks, their interconnections, and how we can really explore the opportunity within these interconnections. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm good. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure for me to participate in the 17th session of the CII. What we're supposed to discuss in this session is global risks and interconnections. But the focus of the conference was on opportunities. I'm going to focus more on the risks. Perhaps we'll come to the opportunities afterwards when we have our interactions with each other. I've been involved in this area of sustainability for a very long time now, from the Brundtland Commission, where I was involved in the writing of the report, later in the UN, and so on. And if I look back at these 35 years or so that I've been involved in this, I see what are the plus points that I see. The plus points I see is growing consciousness and awareness of this at the public level. I also see a growing interest in this at the corporate level. I'm very happy that somebody from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development is with us, because they were the people who were also involved with us when we did the Rio conference, where I was the Deputy Secretary General. And one example of this growth in corporate engagement is that when we did the Rio conference in 1992, and we set up this Council on Sustainable Development, and I'd say we had probably about 25 people. 10 years later, when we did the Johannesburg Conference on Sustainable Development, the number of CEOs who wanted to participate was so large that we had to have a separate parallel event. And now it's got even more, because I think people are realizing the reality, the challenges that we were talking about in the 90s and so on. And secondly, there's a growing interest from the financial side in these long-term issues of sustainability, ESG, etc. This is one of the plus points. The plus point also is the fact that the skepticism about things like climate has more or less disappeared. And even a company like Exxon, which led the charge against climate action, today is a company which is talking about reaching net zero. So that is the other point. The third plus point is the growing integration of NGO activity at the global level. A large number of NGOs have come together at the global level. These are the plus points. The missing thing that I see from this perspective is, it was absolutely clear when we wrote the Brundtland report, when we did the Rio conference, when we did the Commission on Sustainable Development, etc., we will not get action from these interconnected challenges that we face unless we accept some notion of sustainability justice on a fair sharing, responsibility for sustainability between people, between countries. And perhaps the most important area of concern in this is climate, because now we're much more concerned about climate action than we were 30 years ago. And this is one of the greatest challenges that I see in climate action, is the complete absence of any agreed principle of climate justice. Yes, it is true that when we had the debates in UNFCCC, the Western countries have resisted being held responsible for past emissions. But they're also not looking at fairness in terms of future emissions. That at least should be there. Okay, forget what fellows did in the past, but at least can't we be fair when it comes to future emissions? Just share with you a little calculation I have made. I've taken the promises that people have made about what they will reach by levels they will reach by 2030, and the date by which they will reach net zero. And what would be the cumulative emissions of carbon from them, given what they have promised, not choose. But given what they promised, what would be their emissions? What should be the fair share? Fair share. The IPCC tells us that between 2020 and 2050, the world must limit its carbon emissions to 500 billion tons of CO2. 500 billion tons of CO2. Divide it by the person years of population between 2020 and 2050. What it works out to is that on average, over these 30 years, a fair share would be about 1.8 tons per capita per year. That's a fair share. 500 million tons is available. This is the space available. You look at the number of people who will be there between now and 2050. it works out to about 1.8 tons per person per year. I've done a calculation. What would be like the entitlement right of different countries, and what was their promise? I'm not going to trouble with too much of the data. Roughly speaking, let me just say, in the case of China, the range, what their likely emissions will be, is between 200 to 300 billion tons CO2. But their entitlement would be on this 1.8 tons per capita per year standard is 78 billion tons. So it will be roughly 2.5, 3 times what they will be entitled to. In the case of the United States, their range of their emissions, on the basis of what they have promised, is going to be between, say, 60 and 80 million tons. And what's their entitlement? 20 billion tons. So it will be about 4 times, 3 to 4 times what they are entitled to. If I take Europe, including the United Kingdom, that difference is between, say, 35 to 50 is what their emissions would be on the basis of their promises. And what is their entitlement? 28. India is not that badly off. India's emissions on the basis of what it is now and what we have promised in terms of 2030, and now in our case 2070, would be in the range of 70 to 100 billion tons. The entitlement on the basis of our population number would be around 85 billion tons. So in our case, yes, it is possible that we may exceed it by 10, 20%. We can certainly get back to that. And if we are a little faster in terms of reducing our emissions, we will actually be well within what our entitlement should be. And I can talk to you about Russia and Japan. I'm emphasizing this because we are not talking about the past. We're saying just fairness in terms of what you do in the future is what really matters. And unless we agree on a principle of climate justice, this particular risk, which involves interconnections, because India doing something is not enough. It has to be global because of the way carbon emissions affect the atmosphere. So I would say that this is the greatest single challenge that we face. I'm talking more of the risk, not in terms of the opportunities. I would also argue that because of what is already happening, over a 1 degree increase in temperature has already taken place, we will face challenges. And in areas like India, take agriculture. I can't just look at agriculture in terms of what should I do to mitigate carbon. I'll also have to ask myself, what do I do in order to make agriculture more resilient in the face of rising temperatures, greater water uncertainty, which I will face because of climate change. The same thing with our cities. It's not just a matter of designing cities so that you reduce transport, reduce carbon emissions. You'll also have to design your buildings and cities to cope with higher temperatures, more greenery, buildings designed in a different way, and resilience, particularly in coastal areas, because of the storm surges, etc., that you are going to face. But I won't say more on this. I will rely more on Puramita to say a little bit more on the resilience and adaptation front. My final thought is climate justice is not just between countries. Climate justice also has to be domestic in some ways. Let's take India. Let's look at the key part, energy consumption. India needs 3 energy policies to cope with sustainability. About 10% of us have levels of carbon emission which are fully comparable to what it is in the West. We have our cars, we have our air conditioners, we travel by air for vacations. About 40% are in the middle. This is about roughly comparable to the average emissions in the world. There, the focus has to be largely on efficiency. For the 10%, it has to be imposing sustainability standards on them. And the 40%, it has to be promoting efficiency. We also have 50% for whom carbon emissions will go up because they are grossly underprovided with energy right now. So when we talk of climate justice, it also has to be climate justice at a domestic level. We have talked of these things when we talked of the UNFCCC, but we have no action or agreement on these at all. So I will stop here because I only focused on the risk. Maybe I'll say something a little more positive on opportunities later.
No, thank you.
I'll borrow this. Thank you, Mr. Desai, to bringing in the very valid point of how we deal with climate justice. But important point on the interconnections you brought in about the climate change risk is the most significant risk, and it has interconnections to all type of aspect to society. Now, thank you very much. And you also highlighted the economist part. But before I come to you, Punamita, let me go back to Joe, because from WBCSD, you are really focusing much on three pillars, climate actions, inequalities, and biodiversity. And you see a clear linkage between sustainable business practices on all three pillars. I'd like to have your opening statement about how you see this global risk interconnections and how the businesses can leverage to their opportunity. Before I come back to you, let's hear from Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Praboda. And I think
We are unable to hear him.
So I'm trying.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, now it's coming. Yeah, please go ahead.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So thank you, Praboda. And it's an honor to be on this panel with you, Nitinji, and with you, Dr. Punamita. And, you know, it's great to see people in the audience. And I'm sorry I can't be there today. I certainly hope to be at the next summit. The CII summit always brings together really, you know, great interventions and always brings, you know, it's always at the front of the emerging issues, which is really helpful for businesses to be part of. So we at WBCSD, you know, and I'm sure everyone in the room would recognize that sustainability has gone mainstream now. CII have been pushing this agenda for a long time, but now, you know, it's here for good and also for bad. Unfortunately, we feel a lot of the risks. And, you know, I was asked to think about the need for sustainable and resilient supply chains. And Praboda talked about the interdependence that we all have. And I was reflecting that this is different to maybe how supply chains were thought of before COVID, where we thought of supply chains that were maybe, we'd say cheap, or we'd say affordable and reliable. And now, as our economies struggle to gear up again post-COVID, and there's a real pinch on supply chains, that pinch is being exacerbated by a number of crises that are highlighting our independence, but also our vulnerability. So, you know, first, definitely climate change, which is being experienced by us often. Second, conflict. When this war in Europe began, I think those of us not in Europe thought, well, there's conflict in lots of places, and what does this have to do with us? Unfortunately, despite being in one part of the world, it's affecting all of us very much, and is making enterprise more difficult. It's making execution more difficult, and it's making you know, living harder. Many countries are experiencing a lot of domestic polarization, which is making cooperation harder. And also, of course, there is a geopolitical fragmentation going on. And I think that when we're in India, we're aware of it. I recently moved to Singapore, and it became very, very clear, very, very quickly, how, you know, how much pressure there is between two great powers, and how much tension there is, and that again is putting pressure on all of our supply chains. I think that for business, it's really a useful way that we can think about it as companies, and this is in a report called Building Business Climate Resilience from WBCSD, and it's about climate, but actually it's about resilience, and it applies across the piece, and it's based on the experience of companies including the Tatars, ITC, and also Aditya Birla, some of their experience in building resilience. And I think it's a useful way for businesses to think about resilience now in this more squeezed, more straitened time. So first of all, resilience is about being able to withstand the physical risks of climate change. and the political based risks that come with fragmentation in terms of blockades or border or sanctions. Secondly, resilience is about being able to withstand the transition risks. So our world is changing to become net zero. Also, supply chains are being reordered, global corporations being reordered, and in this big shake-up, as businesses, we have to be able to withstand the risks that come with this transition, but also seize the opportunities that are there for us in new products, in new services, in new sources for material. And thirdly, we have to make sure that this transition is meaningful and value creating for our stakeholders. And this is to Mr. Desai's point about a just transition. I think that businesses in India knew before COVID very well that they're only as resilient as the communities around them. That was a lesson that we learned from businesses in India. And one great example is water scarcity. You can have your own water, but the communities around you don't. Then you don't have water because you have to give it to them, for example. So I think that businesses in India understood that well. But now, as we move to a much more challenged time, enabling our communities, our workforces, and other stakeholders to benefit from and succeed in and be protected in the transition is really important. So there are steps that companies can take. I just want to finish my opening remarks also with a word of caution. So I think that we, there are steps that we can take, but I think also we have to be careful about the myth of. There was an article in the Financial Times about the myth of resilience, and every nation and every company is working to establish its own strategic security. Are we energy secure? Are we food secure? And that's necessary. I come from the United Kingdom, and some of you may be aware, we recently set out on a path of independence. And we're finding it much more difficult than many people anticipated. It's much more difficult to have security and have economic prosperity when you cut economic ties and you cut cooperation. So while India is part of building its own strategic security and being part of new supply chains for different actors around the world, and that's right. I think we all have to remember that it's easier to succeed when more of us are cooperating, and that's a kind of generality, but I think it's really important to remember it's very, very hard to totally recreate supply chains. It's very, very hard to succeed on our own or with sections of the world rather than all of us together. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think it's a very important point you brought out. Building resilience possibly help in managing all the interconnections of the risk what globally we are facing. But let me turn to Punamita, to you, to hear from an economist about how she looks at the interconnections between the climate, ecology, and finally economics. And what's your opening statement on the interconnections of the risks?
Thank you. A pleasure to be here. I mean, I can't remember whether I was here at the first one, but since then, I think I've been interacting with various sustainability summits and it's here, and it's really great to see what CII does in terms of holding these summits. These have been fora actually where I've had the pleasure of meeting people like you, Prabodh, and lots of other business leaders as well as association leaders, and I've learned a lot through our interactions. So congratulations to CII for continuing with this great tradition, first of all. So Nitin and Joe have already, sort of made several very valuable points. So I'm going to straight away confess that as I attend more and more of these events and I work more and more on the subject of sustainability, I realize one thing, that I'm increasingly finding it difficult to make a distinction between being an economist and not being interdisciplinary. So some of the stuff I say may not sound very much like an economist, and so apologies in advance if you get disappointed on that score. But 2 points that I feel have really sort of dogged us in identifying opportunities and, have been. One is that we persistently undervalue nature. And the second is, across the spectrum, including academics, agriculture, industry, whether you break it up in terms of sectors or actors, we underinvest massively in reducing risks. So these are 2 things which I think we need to think much more about as economists, planners, financiers. How much are we willing to really invest in reducing risks when we are setting up our projects, our plans, our enterprises? When we are even designing policies which will regulate the environment, or which will regulate how we use water or how we use land or where we are going to put in our resources. We simply do not put risks on the same trajectory. We wait maybe so we do a great job of looking at financial risks. We do a great job, but we do not do a great job of looking at sustainability risks. But I think globally now, a little bit of that is changing, and it could be great if we could start understanding how this could be molded into the sort of environment within India. So for instance, one extreme case, these are all available easily on the net, but I'm not naming countries. So in one case of one developed country, I was told that they are considering legislation, and I've seen that paper, where companies who do not put in place resilience, it's a flood-prone country, if they do not put in place infrastructure which can be labeled as adaptation to flood resilience, they are not going to be allowed to submit their taxes. Can you imagine? They're not going to be allowed to file their taxes. And of course, this was highly controversial, and then it got toned down, and it went, and it is today taken the form of legislation where power sector companies, anybody setting up a power plant, has to first demonstrate that they have put in infrastructure that is adaptive and will reduce the risks from any kind of flooding before they are given the clearance to go ahead and start operating their plant. Now, you would think that this is very obvious, right? It's for the good of the company itself. But it took a fair amount of lived experience, bad experiences, losses, damages, before you reach that trigger and you say, oh, hey, I can do something to stop it. Now, and I think that's the tragedy with sustainability for most of our decision making, because we do not wish to invest in reducing risks, and we do not wish to value nature as much as it should be. So I think these are 2 of the most important points that come to my mind, and I have loads of other examples that I'm happy to share. One point I would like to end with is, I was doing an exercise recently where I was trying to just see what is available in the public domain to try and map what are the big bang stories out of Indian industry on things that have been done for sustainability, right? And great if there are others who can come forward to start doing this. So, what is it? A very actionable response option towards valuing nature or towards reducing risks that any company, industry has been doing, whether a large capex one heavy capex or light capex, cut it any way you want, has done, which is a concrete action which is internalized within that industry. Not saying that you've done a standalone activity and you've invested some amount of CSR funding or some other funding to, reduce biodiversity loss. That's great. Please continue doing it. Or if you've helped communities with their livelihoods, please continue doing it. But where are the stories where you say, I have innovated on my processes so that your goal of sustainability has been served from within the industry? Those sorts of stories are what really appeal to me. Thank you.
Great points, Purnamita. I think from climate justice to building resilience, putting a value to the measures ensure building that resilience further is wonderful viewpoints what we get to manage the interconnections of the global risk. Wonderful. I'll come for one more round of questions to understand a little further, but in the meantime I'll also ask my audience to think about their questions to put forth to our speakers. So I'll come back, or you can ask anytime while they are speaking. Just think about what question you want to be answered. Okay, I'll come to Mr. Desai now. You talked about climate justice. But one thing, our Honorable Prime Minister is also pushing the Atmanirbhar Bharat, how we can be a global supplier to the world. With all these things which is happening, how do you think that India can be a preferred manufacturing country that not only will lead the industry in the need of the globe, but it can be a leader while taking account of all these sustainability trends or global risk emerging out of it? What's your take?
Want to focus on many things here, but let me just focus on one. If you look at a corporation, its future depends, of course, on its profitability, on its competitive strengths, and on its standing in capital markets. Three things are basically going to determine the future of that corporation. Now, from the point of view of competitive strength, I would argue that there is a great case for sustainability. If I look at the history of growth, the 19th century growth was driven by new technologies which made things like steam engines, cheap coal, later oil, etc., new forms of transportation like steamships and railways. That's what drove growth at that point. It's a supply side driven growth because of what was being done in terms of greatly increasing the production of things that people wanted. If I look at the 20th century, growth was driven by consumerism. If you look how many people in 1900 owned, say, consumer durables or cars, and how many people own them in the year 2000, there's a huge difference. And that consumerism was something that was driven very much by the US model of growth. So in the 19th century, it was supply driven. In the 20th century, it was demand driven. But increasingly what you're facing in this, because of the standards which have to be set for sustainability, which will have to be, climate justice is one where this is happening. We may well find standards in other areas like biodiversity, etc., also coming in. You already have standards on air and water pollution. You're also getting other areas. So to me, the growth in the 21st century is going to come from technologies and competitive, which will deliver resource efficiency. This is what is going to be the selling point. He may not want me to say this, but he comes from a company which is a steel manufacturing company, which is very heavily focused on trying to reach net zero for steel. Because it also increases its competitive position vis-a-vis others who are in the same place. So I would argue what should drive the growth in the 21st century is going to be resource efficiency. And this is what India has to aim at if it wants to be a major player in the global economy. So let me just stop at that point and see what he has to say on that.
That's a great point. I think doing more from less has to be the mantra, which has been the ethos of Indian ethics, and that will propel. Let me check if audience has any questions before I come to Joe. But think about if you have questions, plus just let us know. Joe, I'll come back. You talked about just transitions. So with all this happening, how do you see the role of businesses in as accelerating just transitions while building the resilience in their business model?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that tackling inequality is hard for business, and I think Dr. Purnamita talked about the challenge of valuing nature, and I think that nature and inequality are harder for business, but they're really important. And I think it's also important for us to understand that these challenges and solutions are interconnected. And if we just look in the development space, climate is where the world is putting lots of money and resources into tackling. And inequality is what's driving lots of political change. Nature, I think, is where a lot of the solutions are. Solutions that address climate, both through mitigating climate change and also supporting adaptation and building resilience. Also, nature is a place where there are solutions that can improve the quality of lives for people, especially in agriculture. And India is an economy, one of the economies globally that depends most on nature for its economic security. So I think that we have to see that climate, nature, and inequality are interlinked challenges, and the solutions lie together. I think also that when we talk about inequality and the just transition, I think that Mr. Desai was saying that the West has not fully acknowledged its role in supporting a just transition, and I think that I agree, and I'm not confident that that's going to change. And when he talked about it's a between countries and a within countries piece, I think that the West doesn't see it as a between countries thing at all, and that's unfortunate. But meanwhile, we each have our own responsibilities, and we each need to get on. For business, we formed something called the Business Commission for Tackling Inequality, recognizing that this is a hard challenge, to look at what the challenges were and how businesses could respond. And Sanjeev Puri is a commissioner. You all know him from ITC. Also, Siddharth Sharma from the Tatars is a commissioner, and Seema Arora is one of the advisors to the commission. And the first thing that we found is that inequality globally is higher today than it has been for 150 years, and that is having severe consequences for social cohesion and political stability, and is also impacting business success. And the cost of living crisis that many people are experiencing, and which is flowing around the world, is threatening business success very, very directly. We're going to publish our first findings next month. When I say we, the commissioners are going to publish first findings next month. And some of the elements that you'd expect to find there are there about respecting human rights, about enhancing access to products and services. These are concepts that businesses in India have helped to pioneer globally. But I think, the two things that have come out strongest are about paying a living wage, and the responsibility for businesses everywhere to pay a living wage and to address the equity of how risk and value is distributed across the value chain. And that's an important consideration for business leaders now. And the second one is about tax transparency and tax fairness. And these are expectations of business which are now materializing in the courts, in many parts of the world. So I think that these are the priorities for businesses to understand and to address. And I think essential to see challenges are interlinked, but solutions are interlinked as well.
So that's great. I'm really happy to, understand now business has started understanding how tackling inequality is going to be in their favor, and it's important part of their business resilience process. And you possibly listed down the examples very rightfully, and WBC is still leading those initiatives. That's great to hear. Let me again check if anyone, yeah, I think we have a question. If we can pass the mic there before I come back to Purnamita with the discussion. So let us take some questions, audience question in the meantime. Can you please pass on the mic there? Anybody? Is there? Coming. Sorry, Purnamita. We'll take the questions so that and if that question comes to you, that will be fantastic. Yes, please. You can introduce yourself and ask questions.
So first of all, thank you all the speakers for enlightening us. So I am Vikas Sharda. I am a co-founder of the company called SpockTech Green Ventures Private Limited. Sir, my question is to all the panelists. First is everybody is talking about, say, in today's world, I mean the entire, you can say, the planet existence is in question today, and most of the stakeholders today, they are taking more of the voluntary measures, right? Whether it is a company, enterprises, etc., they are taking voluntary measures in terms of reducing the carbon emission, etc. But if we have this question of survival, don't you think that now we need more of the mandatory measures, right? Either through some regulation or through some policy, because we are seeing that some of the countries like say Australia or say South Korea, they are coming up with say national level climate policy, which gives the direction as far as the various measures on the climate actions are concerned. So what is the view of the panelist with respect to the mandatory measures, right, which the government can kind of mandate it through some policy measures? So would like to hear the views of
Thank you for that wonderful question. Planet is the biggest stakeholder of business, and who is going to take care of it? Purnamita, I think I will start from you. How do you think about the regulatory measure? Who is going to speak about the biggest stakeholders?
Thank you. Well, there are two kinds of thoughts. I have no answers. There's no magic bullet. But there are two separate sorts of thoughts that come to my mind. The first thing is, yes, of course, regulations and the policy environment does play a major role. By the way, we do have, we have national level climate change related policies and guidance in place. But just setting that aside for a minute, one thought is this, that there are examples from across the world. So I'll give you an example from one of the, sort of most difficult to sort of address areas is sometimes biodiversity, right? So if you see the history of the US versus Endangered Species Act and its evolution, it may surprise you to know that it started from that point, very similar to such acts in other parts of the world, where you went in for defining conservation areas, right? Uses specific, you have a biodiversity hotspot, you say that this is a protected area, and you develop special rules, there's command and control approach towards it, right? What we call in economics. And over the years, that act has evolved to a situation where they today give permits to farmers in a landscape vision of the area. You continue with the conservation area, but permits to farmers to either do restoration, recovery work to preserve endangered species, but as well as permits to destroy species which go into harming the farmer's interests, but do not clash with the endangered species list. So you see, there are ways in which people have innovated over the years, and there are many examples. So this is one example that immediately came to my mind, that you could evolve from a conservation perspective to a perspective where giving permits to the farmers to even destroy species. That's one. So policy itself has many nuances and many ways of doing policy. But the other important thought that comes to my mind is, there are always expectations from policy. But one of the pillars of a policy being formulated, as well as for a policy to be successful, is what's happening on the demand side. Isn't it? If that demand is not coming from planet Earth's human inhabitants, you see, how would a policy help? How would you could have great policies, and we are all aware of these situations. We have great policies on pen and paper. I think we need to do much more. For successful outcomes, we need to do much more in creating awareness and building the demand for, say, so that you invest in value addition chains where the value addition comes out of fostering a nature society relationship rather than a value addition coming in the supply chain from something that ignores. See, we don't perhaps always deliberately try to harm nature, but we do it, just as something that happens on the sidelines, something that you don't like to think about. So that has to change. Thank you.
Great. I think we must listen from Mr. Desai, who possibly has a privy to a lot of this already developed regulation and developing regulations.
Well, I think she has said a lot on that issue, and it's pretty clear that you are not going to get anywhere without mandatory measures. Certainly on inequality, it is not going to happen without. Do you think any company would observe labor rights if you didn't have labor laws? Do you think any company would observe human rights if we didn't have laws on human rights? I doubt it. So I'd say sooner or later we will have to have this. And this is where the comparative point comes in. Sooner or later, the voluntary measures will have to become mandatory. I remember in 1992, when we were doing the Rio conference, I met a German industrialist who was following the standards of chemical use and leather use, which were way beyond what the European Commission wanted. So I asked him why. He says, I'm doing it because they're going to become mandatory in a few years, and I'll be in a good position to work on that. So if any sensible corporation should assume that sooner or later, what are today voluntary standards are going to become mandatory. Second, the government must recognize there are certain things like inequality, social, which cannot be done without some form of mandatory standards. So I would say a good competitive position should be to anticipate that these things are going to end up as mandatory standards. There's one final point I want to make on this. You see, in many ways, for sustainability, we are asking for action to be taken before the worst effects are seen. And that's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. Now, in the case of climate, we sought to address this by putting in this intergovernmental panel on climate change, of which Purnamita has been a part. And that built up scientific consensus on the future. Much of it is 50 years from now. But it built up that consensus and has led to a sense of action now. But we also had to have some evidence of current change. It's a combination of two things which work. I hope that we in India can also build up capacity for this type of consensus building on what the future is for nature. If we keep on doing this, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in urban development, whether it's in other areas. And this is perhaps something where much more needs to be done than what we are doing now.
Thank you very much. Anybody else has any question? Otherwise, I'll come to you, Joe. Because a lot of regulations are being developed internationally. And even in India, also, there are a lot of regulatory measures already existing. So will you like to shed some light to the questions? What are the international regulations which is being implemented at this point?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's really helpful to think about the regulations that are here, the regulations that are coming, but also the physical constraints, because as businesses, we have to operate within the legal boundaries and within the physical constraints that are there. And I think that we've woken up in this post-COVID world, I hope it's post-COVID, and found that we're a bit late. We're not ready. We haven't prepared for the energy transition. We don't have enough clean energy capacity in place, and now it's very, very challenging to transition quick enough. There may not be enough material available in order to build the infrastructure that we need at the pace required. So Mr. Desai's point about anticipation is very, very important. The direction is clear. There is a tightening domestically and internationally, especially around climate. And one such measure is the likely imposition of a border carbon abatement tax for the EU. And if you're exporting goods to the European Union from a different GHG regime to Europe, then some costs may be applied. And so again, you know, these are the same themes that have been coming up about competitiveness, resource efficiency, anticipation, staying ahead, because what happens is if we don't anticipate, then we're not ready when either the regulations come or the physical constraints come. Definitely regulations can help a lot. And I think that the example in India with plastics regulation has been very powerful, and the ability actually for businesses to switch, it seemed almost overnight, to find new approaches, for example, on plastic straws, and the removal from the from all products of single-use plastics has been dramatic. And again, I've moved to Singapore. If any of you have traveled to Singapore, you'll know the amount of single-use plastic there is here is kind of, you know, is enormous, and a big contrast to what India has been able to achieve through very good regulation. We also know that sometimes regulations can have negative effects and can be poorly designed. And that's the art that every government regulator is wrestling with at all times. So I think the direction is there. That's clear. I think that in order to be successful, businesses have got to anticipate and stay ahead, and transitioning to be net zero, to be nature positive, and to be more equitable is going to position you as a resilient, sustainable company that can succeed and outperform your competitors. I think that's clear.
Thank you very much. I think a very good point you brought out in the terms of carbon border adjustment mechanism, that wow, one regulation in one part of the world can affect all the business across the globe. Because as I started this session with telling that we are living a very interconnected world and interdependent world. So the risk of one region or opportunity of one region is no more restricted to that single area. So it's all we are connected, and it is better to aware about those risks and manage. Listen, we are almost to the time. I possibly can, yeah, one question, Sanjeev, if a mic can. And the last question, if a mic can be passed to Sanjeev. Yeah, please, here. The first table, yeah, first table, yeah.
Thank you, Pramod. That was a wonderful conversation, very enlightening. Many takeaways for me, but one that I would want to get back to is Mr. Desai, the comment that you made, that there is complete absence of an agreed principle for climate justice, and the kind of data that you gave in was also a very absolutely new perspective for us, where entitlement versus what has been promised looks so different. The orders being raised everywhere on various kinds, or in Europe, slowing down the only bright spot that was there in terms of what was happening on climate. How do you think things will pan out going forward? No structures as yet available to create mechanisms where aid could be transferred, funds could be transferred from the north to the south. There is a lot of pessimism that we can see around. 30 years is not too long a time.
Question to you, Mr. Desai. Yeah.
I wish I could give you a positive answer, but I'm not very sure that I can give a positive answer, but particularly with what is happening over the past year, since February. and the growing increase in the number of highly nationalist, narrow-minded governments around the world. So I'd say that I'm not very proud, but I think in the longer term we will, because I think public perception is changing. Corporate perceptions are changing. In fact, today I find corporates are better organized for anticipating the future than governments are in many ways. So I don't see an easy answer to the climate justice issue. But I think we could keep on the issue of, let's say, carbon border adjustment. You know what I would do if I was sitting in a corporation, in a board? I would tell the government, let us go and lobby the government of India to argue against this unilateral exercise of border adjustments. But at the same time, let us remember that government of India may not succeed fully in doing this, so let's be ready for that border adjustment. So argue for your rights from a justice point of view, but also be prepared for the injustices which will continue to prevail.
I think we are in right track. Thank you, Sanjeev, for that wonderful question. Listen, we are completely out of time. Thank you very much. I'm sure you would thank Mr. Desai, Joe, Purnamita for the wonderful conversations we had. Thank you all. Just before I close, I just wanted to say here how we do the interconnections. I realize the business is run in 3 factors in that order. The greed, fear, and recognitions. We talked about the fear factor through regulations, thanks to your question. And the greed, that is that how we put a monetary value to each of the risk and opportunity that will really drive the business to the right things going forward. Thank you, Joe, for joining there from Singapore. Thank you, Mr. Desai. Thank you, Purnamita. Thank you, CII, for inviting us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So with this, we conclude the session on